Thank you so much, Frank, for having us, and Maggie and Molly for sharing your beautiful work. I am so grateful to be able to be in community with the two of you. As Molly mentioned, we have a really active group chat, and that level of day-to-day support for from I know my practice and has meant so much, because as photographers, and I'm sure lots of people on this call know, we work oftentimes alone and in isolation, even when it's not COVID. And so to be able to be making work, particularly that's so personal, and to have people who know us and know our hearts, and with whom we are in constant sort of creative dialogue, to be able to bounce ideas off of, really means a lot. And so to watch how your work has evolved over the past year as our friendships have deepened, and to be able to share my work with you, as I have made what is certainly the most personal work of my career, has been such an honor. So thank you both for
And,
holding so much space.
and the thing that's really important for us and all the viewers is that you guys are open to share it. That's really the gift. That really is the gift for all of us.
Thank
So
you.
you're on, Kate. Sorry.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah, so my name is Kate Warren, and I am a professional editorial and commercial photographer. I've been a freelance photographer for 9 years, splitting my time first in Washington, D.C., and then I moved to Los Angeles in 2019, which is where I met Maggie and Molly. I've worked with clients like the New York Times and the Washington Post and Vanity Fair and Planned Parenthood. But as with many photographers, I'm lucky enough to have my practice be rooted in personal work. And so when the pandemic hit, and I lost all of my client work, as all photographers did, it really caused me to pause and to think about how I was making work, and what work felt most meaningful, and um, what felt most connected to who I am as a person. And so during pandemic, I was quarantined, unfortunately, apart from my partner across the country, because I'd been working bi-coastally, and so he was living in our Washington D.C. apartment, and I was living in our Los Angeles house. And so I was quarantined alone for 6 months, which, as Molly mentioned, takes quite a toll. And so I developed a new way of working during that time that felt radically personal. And after 6 months, I decided that I needed to make a change, and so I found a beautiful 3-bedroom cottage in the Green Mountains of Vermont. This is the view from my house. And so my partner and I moved here in September. This is actually what it looks like outside right now. I wanted to share with all of you what my view looks like from where I'm sitting now. And so that is actually identical to what I'm seeing, just beyond my computer. We're about 10 feet from the edge of the water, because I want all of you to feel sort of brought into this very sort of insular world that we're living in here in the mountains. And so I actually grew up about 20 minutes from where we are currently living. And the land here, is very important to who I am as a person. And I found that when I came back here, it was strongly informing the work that I was making, in a couple of different ways. And so I wanted to treat this as a self-imposed artist residency with this level of isolation. And I really am able to sort of hear my own voice and stay connected to my practice without being pulled into the kinds of pictures I should be making for other people. And that felt like such a blessing in disguise with the pandemic. And so I moved back not only to have this self-imposed artist residency, but because my mother was going blind. Her retina detached last May, and after 4 failed surgeries, it was determined that she would not regain vision in her left eye. And so I came back to provide emotional and daughterly support, and help her sort of process and grieve the trauma of losing her sight. which, as I'm sure you can imagine, as a photographer, is a lot emotionally to be faced with, the loss of sight. And so I created this project, Loss of Central Vision, that is set within that context. And when I moved back, I started experimenting with finding new ways of working. And it was rooted initially in how to support my mother. And so when I came back, I learned to cyanotype print. And cyanotype printing is a photographic process from the 1800s where you chemically treat paper or fabric or wood, and it makes the surface light sensitive. And then you can lay, in this case, plants on it and put it in the sun, and it transforms the surface. And then you rinse it with water to fix it, and it always is this vibrant blue color. And so my plan was to bring together my mother's medium of quilting, which she taught me when we were growing up, and she learned from her mother and her mother before that, and my medium of photography, using cyanotype printing. So I wanted to make a cyanotype quilt, but I had very limited time because the seasons in Vermont are quite extreme. And so I moved back at the beginning of September, and usually the hard frost comes within 6 weeks of that. So I had 6 weeks to learn to cyanotype print as well as possible, and make a whole body of photographic work on paper, and then use those skills to make fabric that I would then use to make this quilt, which you can see here. And so it was fast, and I was spending a lot of time outside, and I was foraging and collecting plants from the forest where I played when I was growing up with my mother's help. And then she and I together dyed the fabrics. And it was this really amazing, very connected process of making things with our hands and getting out in the world when she had been bedridden for months before that. And it became this artistic ritual that we performed together, not only as sort of an extension of the maternal legacy of quilt making within our family, but a way of us sort of healing, sticking points within our own relationship, because I hadn't lived close to my family since I was 18, and I'm 32. And so it was a really amazing opportunity for us to sort of redefine our relationship. So I made these cyanotypes, and I'm making the quilt. And in addition, I'm going out in the world and making pictures. And I'm doing this often with friends. So I made friends with two local photographers here in Vermont, Dan Carden and Macaulay Lerman. And we would say, okay, we're going to pick this small town, and we would drive there, and we'd say, okay, see you later. And we would go separate ways for a couple of hours, and we would make pictures, and studies of the place and the people, and the really like local color, lots of local color. And it was a way for me to redefine my relationship with the place where I grew up, because oftentimes we were going to places I had never been to before. So it became this expansive ritual where we'd go out at the same day every week. And it was very grounding for my practice. And so I made many of the pictures for this project through that process. And it was really an amazing way to expand my knowledge of Vermont as well. And in this case, this picture was visiting a friend from high school who's now living off the grid, homesteading in the Northeast Kingdom up near Canada with no running water or electricity, and happy as a clam. So I went and stayed up on their homestead, and to see these other ways of living really sort of hit the reset button on how I'd been living in Los Angeles. It was a transformative process. And then there were parts of my practice from LA that I kept. So I developed a strong self-portrait practice. And so this is a self-portrait that I made shortly after arriving in Vermont as well. And then the pictures that I was making in the landscape here were very connected to nature, and sort of recognizing the sacred object quality of the things that were happening in the natural world around me. So set within that framework, I was spending all this time with my family, and in the context of COVID, grief was really rising to the surface. Obviously, we're going through sort of a collective grieving of our change of way of life, and lost loved ones, and dreams that are no longer going to come to fruition the way we thought they would. And so I was really reflecting on how grief was manifesting in my family, And that was calling me to engage with archival materials. So Loss of Central Vision became a project that included still photographs, archival material, writing, and quilting. So I'll take you through through some of that work. This is my father on the right with his sisters Beverly and Nancy. We called them the girls. I inherited my aunt's bedroom furniture, heard their laughter echo as I played with their toys. Do all children play with ghosts? I saw them through the fear in my father's eyes as he taught me to drive. Girls ride guardrail to death. The auto that carried two Massachusetts girls to their death yesterday on the state thruway was guided to the bridge abutment by a guardrail, state police said. Trooper Eugene Mack said the car climbed the rail and rode it for about 30 feet and then shot into the air and struck the bridge. So in June of 1970, my aunts, Nancy and Beverly, who were 11 and 17 years old, were killed in a tragic car accident. My dad was 19 and he had recently moved away from home for the first time. Obviously, this loss devastated the family. And it's a loss that we rarely spoke about in my family. Growing up, there were no pictures of the girls in our house. We didn't refer to them by name. We only called them the girls because it was easier. It hurt my dad too much not to. And I understood. But I wanted to also I felt the loss of the relationship as well. I spent time imagining what kind of aunts they would have been or the lives they would have lived, and it made me sad. And so Loss of Central Vision seeks to bridge that gap and help me build my connection with my aunts. As part of the process of making this work, I dove deeply into the family archives. And while doing that, I found this pocket notebook that at first I thought belonged to my grandmother. It detailed mileage and daily expenses. You know, a gallon of milk is 50 cents from the early 1970s. But at closer reading, I came to understand that the notebook belonged to my grandfather. And it detailed not only the mileage and the expenses, but daily missives of his grief. Because at the end of every transmission, he would say things like, "Sure miss Bev and Nancy. I get so lonely for them." It is very simple, straightforward language. You know, in this previous paragraph, he's talking about a pot roast that my dad really liked, right? So this like daily ritual of grieving that we don't often see publicly because there's so much shame around it, especially I think with men. And this loss was particularly hard on my grandfather, who was a soft man who owned the local hardware store, Warren Hardware, and played the trumpet in a big band in the 1940s. And so I've made pictures in our local hardware stores here. And he never processed the grief, and what ultimately happened was that he died of a broken heart. He had a sudden heart attack at 57 within 3 years of the girls dying. And so within a 3-year period, my father lost almost his whole family, which is heartbreaking. I can't even begin to fathom the weight of that loss. And so my Aunt Nancy and Aunt Beverly appear in my dreams and in the dreams of my partner. And they're always holding hands. And when I've worked with mediums, they always see them holding hands. And it's which is super interesting, obviously. And because for me, I like to think about not only what's lost, but what's still present, right? Like I personally believe that when we pass, we just go to the other side of the veil, right? But you're still able to have a presence if you want it. And people stay here in this world for a variety of reasons. The girls had clearly passed on, and I've worked with people who couldn't get in touch with them. But when I started doing this project, they started visiting my partner in particular on a regular basis. They were like very interested in being actively involved in the making of this work. which is super interesting to me. And so, you know, I think about like how do you navigate consent with somebody who's passed? How do you have agency when you don't have a body? Which are wild questions to be asking, for sure. But spirituality is really important to my practice. And so I want to sort of be thinking about these things as I'm making the work.
Yeah, Kate, I hesitate to interrupt you because the story is so compelling. Was there ever a point where you thought, I'm going too far? Or do I want to continue? Is this too pain? You were always all in.
Yeah, I mean, the only way out is through.
Yeah.
And sort of the purpose of this project and projects like this is to heal ultimately, right?
And
Is
why now, Kate?
the things that we don't talk about, and that, you know, and I was just going to speak to this, like, you know, thinking about, as I'm making this project, thinking about what happens after a loss like that. Like, what's left? What kind of void exists? How do you then fill that void? What does the process of healing look like? You know, how does shame show up, right? I was raised Catholic, and oftentimes people are religious, and so they ask questions like, why would God do this? What did I do to deserve this? And to me, it's not my role to answer that question, but to acknowledge that that's a question that's commonly asked. So this picture says confessional, no face-to-face confession, please, which I think really speaks to our culture that tells us to hide, no face-to-face, right? Like, be private in your grief, be private in your suffering. And I think, yes, obviously it's radically emotional for me to be making this work and to be sharing it, but it's healing to do so too, to bring it out into the light. Because when we don't, it can take over. It takes over who we are, and it subsumes who we can become. And everybody processes this kind of thing differently, obviously, and there's no wrong way to process intergenerational trauma or grief. Everyone has their own way. Finding peace in your own way, I think, is important. This is a model boat that belongs to my father, and his father had a boat, and my dad has a boat, and the name of the boat is War and Peace. And that is his happy place. That is where he goes to find peace. And so he has these rituals and practices that like offer him peace through this. My connection to my partner, who's pictured here, is part of how I find peace. You know, relying on loved ones, being vulnerable, sharing these kinds of stories, I think is incredibly important for me personally. You know, and to answer the second part of your question, Frank, like, making this work was radically difficult. And so having the support of my partner has been absolutely so important as I go through the process of understanding what all of this means to my family, to my father, to my dad.
And what's the time period of this body of work?
Yeah, so I've made this body of work since September.
Wow.
So it's early. It feels quite early for me. It needs time. So this is the lake on which I'm living. I found it to be very healing and peaceful to live here. So there's a bit more writing. This piece is birthright. Grief runs in one side of my family, blindness in the other. My mother's father grew bitter as he lost his sight, computer screen eyes glowing. The scientist wrote books he could never read. At twilight on the Conemaugh Trail, he refused to see his children, even when he couldn't. Grandma's vision went not long after, dimmed the light she used to write about a Chicago house full of women in the 1930s. I make pictures from her poems and poems from her pictures. My mother and I quilt to feel immortal. Our fingers bleed onto the fabric from countless pinpricks. Half blind herself, her mother's unfinished quilt sits between us, soft as time. One day she will go blind like her father. So will I. So the other piece of this, obviously, is not only reflecting on the grieving of the loss in my father's family years ago, but the grief of my mother losing her sight now. And the potential loss of my sight as well. And so, because my mother has the genetic markers for macular degeneration, which her father suffered from, which is the leading cause of blindness in adults. And so it is highly likely that I will go blind one day. And so as a photographer, I'd have to sit with and reckon with what it means to see, what it means to make images, and what my process is around that. So I'm trying. It behooves me to embrace that difficulty so that I can build a process of making images while I have sight that I can use once I don't. So it's sort of in the back of my mind through all of this. And here are some images of sort of maternal legacy that's important to me. This is the quilt that my grandmother started before she lost her vision. My mom is now finishing it. And there is fabric in my grandmother's quilt that is also in my quilt, which you can see here. It's huge. I'm going to be quilting this thing by hand for a year. And moving back to my hometown, which is known for the round church, is also an opportunity for reckoning. That everyone has sort of a conflicted relationship with the place where they grew up, and being able to live back here as an adult, especially during COVID, has been an opportunity for redemption. And so as I think about blindness and grief and sort of how blindness is a form of grief and how these things intersect, these archival images really sort of stick with me. This is the church where my great-grandmother got married in Chicago. And I photographed the negative, which has degraded with these orbs in place, which I think is really interesting because in spiritual photography, oftentimes orbs represent the spirit. And so as I think about how soft time is between the generations and how to depict my relationship to my maternal legacy, this is an interesting thread. And it's overwhelming, right? Like all of this is a lot. And I feel grateful to have the time and emotional support to think about, one day I will not be able to see the sunlight on this doorknob. One day I will not be able to see this rainbow across the lake from my house.
Kate,
one day I will not be able.
Tell us about your partner.
Yeah, he's amazing. I'm so lucky. We met living in Washington, D.C., and he has an amazing creative spirit as well, and is just so grounding. And he's here on the call listening. So thank you, sweetheart, for being there for me. And he talks through all of this. He's my first editor. He helped me figure out how to structure this talk, because none of this project was not structured to be orally conveyed yet, since it's very much in progress. And he's helped me process all of the feelings that come with making this kind of work. So I certainly couldn't do it without his support.
Yeah, he must be a special guy.
I'm very lucky. He really is. So, I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations, because when we don't, our grief can go unchecked and can go in directions and become things that we can't control or don't intend. So one final written piece to share as we come to the end here. This is the Gray Veil legacy. Memories lay stacked in the basement, arranged in rows behind closed doors. You dated each in sprawling cursive, snapshots tracking years as they slipped by. Fireworks explode as we blink, white light fading to a cacophony of color at dusk. Orbs of our ancestors float by, observing the gifts they suffered before passing on. A gray veil cloaks our vision, not pitch black, not yet, but gray, light filtering through a curtain as we learn to move through shadows. The things we hope will help weigh heavy on scar tissue. We may be doing more harm than good, so we try and try. We can't talk about it now. The journey we're traveling is close. I don't know if one day the gray will fade to black. And so to write this piece, I interviewed my mother about her experience of losing her sight and then took what she shared, oftentimes with, verbatim sort of fragments, and wrote this, because this is how she describes her site to be now. And so as I think about the continuation of the project, I think about how to make pictures that approximate what she sees, approximate what it means to lose your sight. And because it's a spectacular process, and there's still so much they don't know about vision and how the eye works. And so I look forward to doing that, and look forward to making more imagery while sight restricted myself, to better relate, and to continue sort of animating my aunts and bringing them into this process, and collaborating more closely with my parents as well. And that's it.
That is just what a powerful story, my God. To share that so eloquently is a gift. One thing to tell everybody, tell all of your colleagues that each one of these chats are going to be on the projections.live site. So if they've missed it, you have to force them to go see it. So the three of these chats will be on projections, within a few days. But so does it continue now, Kate, for you? Like, where do you go?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm attending a MFA in art photography program at Syracuse University, studying under Doug Dubois, to continue the work for the next 3 years in a designated academic setting.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yep.
And the three of you, I know and I have to say, like, nobody has left, and there's always people. I mean, the three of you really have created such an incredible evening for all of us. I mean, you just look through the chat room. I mean, everyone is just humbled. And Kate, to share all those interesting stories and sentiment, and the fear that you're living with, and the grief. I mean, that's so heartwarming to allow us in.
Thank you for having me and holding the space.
And I really have to thank Molly. I mean, like I said, Molly said, I've got two friends that I think we could do it together. And another thing, I haven't done this ever before, but this is an annual now. In what month? We're in April. Every April, you three will be doing projections. Put it in your book. You tell me the date, but you guys have to come back. I mean, we want to see, more of these stories. They're just phenomenal, really. I mean, everyone is humbled by it. And really,
thanks everybody.
I'm absolutely speechless. It's beautiful work. It's yeah. If anyone has questions, please. I'm not usually tongue-tied. Everyone will tell you that. But yeah, this is
somebody, I'm going through the chat. Someone asked how you find mediums that you can trust to work with. It's interesting. So both Maggie and I have done work in the witch community. I did a long-term project on witchcraft for the Washington Post magazine, and so I have quite a bit of experience in those communities, or with folks who work in those spaces professionally. I mean, at this point now, I'm like, well, I can tell if someone knows what they're talking about. But there are certainly ways to sort of discern how talented someone is and how experienced they are. And there are a couple of different approaches. So to think through sort of like what kind of experience you want to have. Some people work with pendulums. Some people like channel the voices of the people that you're communicating with directly, and are just a channel themselves. There are lots of different approaches. So if you have questions, or you're interested in connecting with people who do this kind of work, please feel free to message me. I'll put my email in the chat, or you can find me on Instagram, and I'm happy to help with that, because it is tricky. But generally,
did you always believe, Kate? Did you?
Oh no! I mean, I was raised Catholic, which is obviously like quite a mystical religious
Yeah.
tradition. But doing that project on witchcraft was transformative. Saw things that you can't unsee, and it felt quite natural too. At least for me, it's not like a thing that, if it didn't feel like learning something new, it felt like remembering.
Really.
Yeah. Yeah, because you look at how little kids interact with this kind of thing, right? They're like, "Mommy, who's the old man in the front yard?" There's no one there, right? Like
Yeah.
we're not taught these kinds of languages. But I know Molly and Maggie and I all sort of are sensitive to this kind of stuff, and I'm lucky enough that my partner is as well. So when like my dead aunts visit his dreams, he knows how to communicate
Wow.
with them and then talk to me about it, which is super lucky because that's not my skill set. So different people have different skill sets. So I'm really grateful to sort of have those people around.
Yeah, that is just because I have to say, I mean, I'm Catholic, but that's not part of it. I cannot get to the idea of believing, but then I know a few people who really are all in, and they have these kinds of moments, and that your partner has moments that are about your family is,
I'm very grateful.
man,
He's like the most adjacent open channel, basically,
beautiful. Well,
because it's not my thing. My dream space is like real dense. So he's
yeah.
definitely the easiest way to sort of get to me, which is nice.
Well, yes. So I thank everyone for staying with us, and I thank the three of you for doing such a great job. Molly for really putting this together. Maggie and Kate for sharing these really beautiful, intimate stories with us has just been a real gift. One of the real highlights of 5 years of doing this. A really special night. I can't thank you enough. And please tell everyone to come to projections.live and see these recordings. It's We just witnessed magic tonight. I mean, that was really great. So we can open up all the microphones, Jay, and if anyone has comments or questions, fire away to the ladies, or if you're dropping off, enjoy the rest of your night.
Hey Molly, I got a quick question. That photo that you have of the yogurt store, where was that? Because that looks really familiar to me.
It's in Silver City, New Mexico.
Okay, never mind. Not where I thought it was. Never mind.
Okay, great. Yeah. Everyone just loves. Yeah, Louisa put me to the test. I just witnessed magic, and you still don't believe, man. I got to come around. I have to come around. But yeah. So
Question. For giving us the space. Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Hey, Mom? What, Molly?
Oh, I was just saying thank you for giving us the space, but I think somebody was also trying to speak.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, Kate, with your work, I thought it looked like most of the images you showed were vertical. Is that like portrait format? Is there a reason behind that?
I tend to be really drawn to that format. I think in speaking to in acknowledging your observation that it's portrait format. I think that tracks with the idea that everything is a portrait or has the ability to be a portrait, and so working in that vertical format sort of indulges that sense of animism, right? So like even if it's a picture of a cute mushroom, like that has a whole personality, and if it's shot as a vertical, it sort of it contributes to that sense of life.
Yeah, it's very. I get it now. It's like very anthropomorphic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Giving it that sense. It's a portrait. Yeah, it's cool.
Hey,
Thank you.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
This is Linda Seaton. I'm an art historian. I'm one of Molly's former professors. And I think that perhaps the verticality also alter piece format. And I mean, that's what it is. In art history, we think of vertical compositions as iconic, a way to communicate, or as machines really to communicate with the divine, while a horizontal image tends to be more narrative. I think subconsciously, perhaps your Catholic training
Oh,
has
yes.
been transformed
Thank
in
you.
your work to another spiritual realm.
Thank you. I love that. And I'm totally adopting it because it is on point. Thanks for that.
Always new insights.
You're welcome.
So grateful that one of my undergrad professors still would show up to something like this. So thank you for coming.
You're very welcome. I would not miss it.
No, that's great. That's
We're
great.
always learning.
Great. Yeah.
Hey,
So-
Frank, it's Glenn. Thanks
Hey,
again.
Glenn.
This is one of the best projections I've ever heard.
Yeah, that's Glenn Backen, a creative director at a big ad agency in New York. Thanks, Glenn. It's great to see you. And
It's
yeah, that was spectacular.
terrific. I think the thing I'd wanted to add, Frank, is all three women whose work I'm not familiar with until tonight. The stories that accompany it, bring so much strength to the images. Everyone kind of knows that, but not always though. That isn't always the case. And you pointed that out a few times, that how well spoken all three women are. Especially at the end, Kate, I was so lulled into the storytelling. I was drifting in and out of the images because of just your style specifically. It was just absolutely wonderful. And I almost wish that when your work is shown, all three of you, but especially that, you, Kate, at the end, I wish your voice can accompany the images,
Thank
and I think I wrote that in the chat. That makes this stuff so much stronger. I mean, all three of you were just, absolutely perfect. But so congratulations to all three of you as friends and as artists.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. That's so kind.
And like I said, we have you guys booked because you're going to get all these calls now. Everyone wants you guys to speak and this and that, and you won't talk to us. Want your big deals and all this other stuff. But we have you for April for sure. That's
There's one question in the chat for Kate asking about your process and how you decided to include text with imagery. And I think that's really integral to your work. So if you don't mind sticking around for a minute, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Dana. My grandmother was a writer, and she was an English teacher for many, many years. But she wrote poetry and was published and belonged to a poetry community. And she taught me to write starting when I was 6. And so writing is the foundation for my entire creative practice. And it's traditionally been a private part of my practice, but particularly for this body of work, it's so rooted in maternal legacy. It felt important to bring not only the quilting and my photographic process to the table, but the writing as well. And there are components in the poems that I shared that reference her poems as well, and subjects that she covered or imagery that she felt drawn to. And my writing style is certainly informed by hers. So my decision to include text is an homage to my grandmother.
Great. Any other questions? Any other issues? I see Juliet Wolf there from.
Hi, Juliet. Thanks for coming.
I got one for Kate real quick. In thinking about the sort of generational divide between your grandmother, your mother, and potentially you going blind, it occurred to me when you were talking about it, how differently each generation must have prepared or like just come to terms with going blind. And I'm still trying to like sort of get my head around what the question is that I'm asking. But have you started, because your mom is not totally blind yet, is that something that you guys have discussed at all?
A little bit, yes. And your observation that each generation handles these things differently is really apt. My mom's not dealing with it, not directly. And I'm sort of trying to get out ahead of it as far and as fast as possible, so it doesn't overtake me, because the idea is so overwhelming. And if I'm like, all right, well, I'm 32, I'll go blind when I'm 82, so that gives me, it gives me 50 years to figure out how to deal with it. But everyone's different, right? Like just because my mom is like a keep calm and carry on person who, you know, will who's processing it in her own way that's healthy for her. And so all I can do is honor her experience and support her in her process while engaging in mine.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, yeah. You guys have silenced, you know, everyone's in you know, in thought, which is great, which is really great. And
You're right.
you know, Glenn does mention there that you know, 50 years from now, you know, science being the way it is, maybe we'll have a cure for it.
They're working on it. I hope you're right.
You know, that's that would be nice. That would be very nice. So with that, we will say good night. We thank everyone. Like I say, you know, we'll have you back anytime you want to come back, and we appreciate it. We appreciate you guys shedding all your skin. That's, you know, that's the beauty of this. So thank you very much, and we'll see everybody later in April. We think we're gonna have another one at the last week of April, another projection. So stay tuned.